Welcome to HorrorCam. I know these videos are meant to help you drift off to sleep, but before you do, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss another chilling tale. I still remember the day I joined Kramik Enterprises. It was the kind of job people fought tooth and nail to get. A coveted position in one of the most powerful corporations in the city. The paycheck alone was enough to turn heads, but it wasn't just the money. The title on my business card carried weight, opening doors to exclusive events and invitations to circles I had only dreamed of entering. My friends envied me, my family celebrated, and I too was caught in the glow of my so-called success. The headquarters of Kramik Enterprises was a towering skyscraper, piercing the skyline like a blade. Its mirrored windows reflected the city's chaos below, giving the illusion that nothing could touch it. Inside, the air was cool, crisp, and almost sterile. Everything seemed perfect. The kind of perfection that made you uncomfortable if you stared at it for too long. On my first day, I was greeted by a cheerful HR manager named Clara. She guided me through a tour of the office, her voice lilting with pride as she pointed out the high-tech conference rooms, the luxurious employee lounges, and the state-of-the-art facilities. Everyone I met wore perfectly tailored suits, their smiles as polished as their appearances. Yet, beneath the surface, there was something big. I couldn't put my finger on it at first. It was just a feeling, an instinctive shiver at the base of my spine. People avoided eye contact for just a second too long. Their laughter felt rehearsed, their movements too controlled. I chalked it up to nerves. After all, it was my first day. But as the elevator carried me to the top floor where my office awaited, the unease lingered, clinging to me like a shadow I couldn't shake. When was the last time? And then I met him. Mr. Adrian Voss, the CEO of Kramik Enterprises, was every bit the commanding figure I had imagined. Tall and impeccably dressed, he carried himself with an air of authority that made the room feel smaller when he entered. His features were sharp, almost otherworldly. Jet black hair slicked back, piercing blue eyes that seemed to see straight through you, and a smile that could freeze your blood. He extended a hand to me, his grip firm and ice-cold. "Welcome to Kramik Enterprises," he said, his voice smooth and deep, like velvet wrapped around steel. "We've heard great things about you." There was no warmth in his tone, no trace of the excitement that usually came with meeting new talent. His words were precise, calculated, as if he was weighing me in some invisible balance. But what struck me the most was his gaze. Those piercing blue eyes seemed to shimmer for a moment, almost glowing under the harsh fluorescent lights. I blinked, and the effect was gone, leaving me questioning whether I had imagined it. As I settled into my role over the following weeks, the strangeness only grew. Kramik was efficient. Too efficient. Projects were completed ahead of schedule with an almost supernatural precision. There were no mistakes, no errors, no room for human frailty. At first, I marveled at the sheer brilliance of the company's operations, but soon I began to wonder, how could everything run so perfectly, so flawlessly, without something or someone paying the price? Adrian Voss was at the center of it all. His presence was magnetic, almost hypnotic. People revered him, feared him. In meetings, he spoke with an authority that demanded obedience, his words carrying a weight that silenced even the most confident voices in the room. But it was in the way employees stiffened when he walked by, the way conversations died the moment his name was mentioned. People worked late into the night, pushing themselves to exhaustion, as if driven by an invisible force, and yet no one ever complained. I tried to ignore the warning signs, telling myself I was overthinking things. After all, this was my dream job, but the cracks in the facade grew harder to ignore. One evening, as I stayed late to finish a report, I noticed something strange. From my office window, I had a clear view of Adrian's private elevator. It was sleek and modern, reserved exclusively for him. But that night, as the clock struck midnight, I saw him emerge, flanked by two of his closest associates. Their expressions were cold and grim, their movements eerily synchronized. Adrian carried a leather-bound book under his arm, its cover marked with strange symbols I couldn't decipher. He glanced around the empty floor, his eyes briefly catching the glow of my computer screen. For a moment I was certain he had seen me. My heart pounded as I ducked beneath my desk, holding my breath until the elevator doors closed behind him. That was the first time I truly felt the weight of the secret I had unknowingly stepped into. The days turned into weeks, and the unease only deepened. Employees began disappearing quietly, without explanation. One day, someone's desk would be filled with personal items. The next, it would be cleared out as if they had never existed. The official story was always the same. They had resigned, found better opportunities elsewhere. But there were no farewell parties, no goodbyes, just empty desks and unanswered questions. And Adrian's associates, his inner circle, always seemed to know more than they let on. They moved through the office like shadows, their presence barely registering until it was too late. I overheard whispers of late-night meetings and secret deals, but every time I tried to dig deeper, I hit a wall of silence. It was Danny, my best friend and confidant, who finally voiced what I had been too afraid to say out loud. "Something's not right here," he told me one evening. "Adrian, he's not normal. I think he's hiding something dangerous." Adrian began to cry. At the time, I laughed it off, trying to dismiss the fear creeping into my thoughts. But deep down, I knew Danny was right. Adrian Voss was no ordinary man, and neither were his associates. That realization marked the beginning of a nightmare I would never wake from. The first day in the office, I felt it, a suffocating aura that clung to the air, heavy and inescapable. It wasn't just the cold, sterile environment. No, this was something deeper, something unnatural. The walls of Kramik Enterprises gleamed with opulence, the floors polished to a mirror shine, and the faint scent of lavender lingered in the air. Everything was designed to impress, to dazzle, to overwhelm the senses. But beneath the glittering surface, there was a tension that crawled over my skin like static electricity. I tried to brush it off as first-day jitters, but the feeling persisted, growing stronger with every step I took through those pristine halls. The employees I passed wore polite smiles, but their eyes told a different story. Blank, hollow, as if they were merely going through the motions. The energy in the office was wrong, as if some unseen force was draining the life out of everything around it. Danny, my best friend since college, had joined Kramik Enterprises with me. He had landed the position of Adrian Voss's secretary, a job that on paper seemed both enviable and terrifying. Adrian wasn't just the CEO, he was a legend. A man whose reputation preceded him in every way. People spoke of him with a mix of reverence and fear, their voices dropping to whispers whenever his name came up. Danny was waiting for me in the break room when I arrived that morning, a cup of coffee in hand and a grin on his face. He always had a knack for making even the most tense situations feel manageable. But that day there was something off about him, too. His usual energy was subdued, his smile tight and forced. "How's it going so far?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light. He shrugged, glancing around the room as if checking to see if anyone was listening. "It's different," he said, his voice low. "That's not exactly reassuring," I joked, but Danny didn't laugh. Instead, he leaned in closer, his expression serious. "Listen," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Our boss, he's hiding something." Those words sent a chill down my spine. "Hiding something?" I echoed, trying to keep my tone casual, though my heart was already racing. "Like what?" Danny shook his head. "I don't know yet, but there's something about him, something wrong. You'll see what I mean." Before I could press him further, the door to the break room swung open and a group of employees walked in, their conversations lively and superficial. Danny straightened up immediately, his guarded expression replaced with a bright, practiced smile. As the day went on, I began to notice what Danny had meant. Adrian Voss was a man of contradictions. He was charming, charismatic even, but there was a coldness beneath the surface that was impossible to ignore. Every word he spoke seemed carefully calculated, every gesture deliberate. His presence commanded attention, yet it also left an unsettling void in the air, as if the room itself recoiled from him. During my orientation, I caught glimpses of his inner circle, his trusted associates who always seemed to be lurking in the shadows. They were a peculiar group, each of them exuding an aura of authority that bordered on intimidation. Their eyes were sharp, predatory, and they moved through the office with an eerie synchronicity. One of them, a woman named Victoria, had a particularly unnerving presence. She was beautiful in a way that felt almost inhuman. Flawless skin, piercing green eyes, and a smile that seemed more like a warning than a gesture of friendliness. She spoke little, but when she did, her words carried an unspoken weight that silenced everyone around her. Then, it wasn't long before the rumors started reaching me. Whispers about late-night meetings in Adrian's office, employees who were called up to the top floor and never seen again, and strange packages delivered after hours. At first I dismissed them as office gossip, the kind of stories people tell to make their mundane jobs feel more exciting. But as the days turned into weeks, the whispers grew louder, and the coincidences became harder to ignore. And one evening, Danny and I stayed late to finish some paperwork. The office was eerily quiet, the hum of the fluorescent lights the only sound breaking the silence. As we worked, Danny suddenly froze, his eyes fixed on the glass door leading to the hallway. "Did you see that?" he whispered. I followed his gaze but saw nothing. "See what?" Danny shook his head, his face pale. "I thought I saw..." "Never mind. It's probably just my imagination." The fear in his voice was real, and it was contagious. The unease reached its peak one night when I decided to stay late and get a head start on a big project. The office was deserted, the usual bustle replaced by an oppressive silence. I was halfway through a report when I heard it. A faint, rhythmic sound, like footsteps echoing through the empty halls. I froze, my pulse quickening. The sound grew louder, closer, until it stopped right outside my office door. For what felt like an eternity, there was nothing but silence. Then, slowly, the handle of the door began to turn. I held my breath, my eyes glued to the door as it creaked open just a fraction. But before I could see who or what was on the other side, the handle snapped back into place and the footsteps retreated into the distance. When I told Danny about it the next day, he didn't seem surprised. "That's what I've been trying to tell you," he said, his voice grim. "There's something wrong with this place, with him." I wanted to believe it was all in our heads, that we were just letting our imaginations get the better of us. But deep down, I knew the truth. Kremik Enterprises was not what it seemed, and Adrian Voss was hiding something. Something dark, something dangerous. I just didn't know how deep the darkness ran. Danny was never one to jump to conclusions, but when he started telling me about the things he'd seen in Adrian's office, I could hear the fear in his voice. It was late one evening after most of the staff had gone home, and we were sitting in the dimly lit break room. Danny leaned in close, his eyes darting toward the door as if he expected someone to burst in at any moment. "There's something going on upstairs," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I've seen things I can't explain." "What kind of things?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light, though my pulse quickened. Danny hesitated, his fingers nervously tracing the rim of his coffee cup. "Unmarked packages. They come in after hours, always delivered directly to Adrian's office. And those late-night meetings, they're not just business discussions. I swear, I've heard chanting, low, guttural, almost inhuman." I laughed, though it sounded hollow even to me. "Come on, Danny, you're just tired. Long hours can mess with your head." But Danny didn't laugh. His expression was deadly serious. "I'm not imagining this," he insisted. "There's something wrong with him, with all of them. I see it in their eyes, the way they move. It's like they're not normal." I wanted to brush it off, to tell him he was being paranoid, but there was something about the way he said it, a quiet desperation in his voice that stuck with me. Then came the first death. It happened on a Monday morning, the kind of day when everyone was dragging themselves into work after the weekend. The news spread quickly through the office. James, a junior employee from the marketing department, had been found dead in his apartment. He was young, healthy, only 28. The coroner ruled it a heart attack, a freak occurrence, but Danny was the first to voice what everyone else was too afraid to say. "It wasn't a heart attack," he told me, his voice low and urgent. "I saw Adrian talking to James the night before, in his office, late at night." I stared at him, trying to process what he was saying. "Are you sure?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Danny wouldn't lie about something like this. He nodded, his expression grim. "I'm sure." James looked scared. And Adrian, he was... I don't know how to describe it. Calm, but not in a good way. Like he knew something the rest of us didn't. The details of James's death were unsettling. His body was found slumped over his desk, his face pale, his eyes wide open as if he'd seen something terrifying in his final moments. The official report said it was a heart attack, but there were rumors, whispers of strange marks on his wrists, of a faint metallic scent lingering in the air. It didn't make sense. James had no history of health problems, no warning signs. One day he was fine, the next he was gone. I couldn't stop thinking about what Danny had said. Adrian had been the last person to see James alive, and the way Danny described it, the fear in James's eyes, the eerie calmness in Adrian's demeanor, it sent a chill down my spine. I started paying closer attention to Adrian and his inner circle. They were always composed, always in control, but there was something else, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. A darkness that seemed to follow them, lingering in their wake like a shadow that couldn't be shaken. The late-night meetings became more frequent, the chanting Danny had mentioned growing louder and more distinct. I stayed late one night, determined to hear it for myself. Hiding in the shadows near the stairwell, I waited, my heart pounding as the clock ticked closer to midnight. Sure enough, I heard it, a low, rhythmic hum that sent shivers down my spine. It wasn't in any language I recognized, and yet it felt ancient, primal, as if it came from a place far beyond human comprehension. I crept closer, careful not to make a sound. The chanting grew louder, more intense, until it seemed to reverberate through the walls. My hands trembled as I pressed my ear to the door of Adrian's office. And then it stopped. The silence was deafening, the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. I didn't dare move, my breath caught in my throat. After what felt like an eternity, I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, and coming straight toward the door. I panicked, retreating into the shadows just as the door swung open. Adrian stepped out, his face calm, his expression unreadable. He was alone, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was still in that room. He paused for a moment, his eyes scanning the hallway. For a brief, horrifying second, I thought he had seen me, but then he turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing in the silence. I didn't sleep that night. The image of Adrian standing in the doorway, his face bathed in the faint glow of the office lights, was burned into my mind. The next morning, Danny confronted me in the break room. "You were there last night, weren't you?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, unable to find the words to respond. "You heard it, didn't you? The chanting." I nodded again, my throat dry. "What does it mean?" I finally managed to ask. Danny shook his head. "I don't know, but it's not good. And James, I think he knew something he wasn't supposed to. That's why he's dead." The weight of his words settled heavily on my shoulders. I wanted to tell myself it wasn't true, that we were just imagining things, but deep down, I knew better. James's death was no accident, and Adrian Voss was at the center of it all. It started innocently enough, or at least that's how it seemed. A few employees resigned unexpectedly. Their desks were cleared out overnight, their personal items boxed up and gone before anyone had even realized they were leaving. At first, people chalked it up to the high-pressure environment. Kramic Enterprises was known for its demanding culture, and burnout wasn't uncommon, but something about it didn't feel right. These weren't just routine resignations. There were no goodbye emails, no farewell parties, no hints of dissatisfaction. It was as if they had simply vanished. Their existence erased as smoothly and efficiently as one deletes a file on a computer. The first was an intern, Lisa, who had been with the company for only a few months. She was bright, ambitious, always eager to impress. One Friday afternoon, she was at her desk, chatting with co-workers and planning for the weekend. By Monday morning, her workstation was spotless, as if she had never been there. "Lisa quit," someone said casually when I asked about her. Guess she couldn't handle the pressure. But that didn't make sense. Lisa had been thriving, at least on the surface. Her sudden departure left a sour taste in my mouth, but I let it go. People leave jobs all the time, I told myself. Then it happened again. A senior analyst named Victor was next. He had been with the company for years, a cornerstone of the finance department. One day he was leading a presentation in the conference room, his voice calm and confident as always. The next, his desk was empty. No one seemed to know where he'd gone. Victor moved on to a better opportunity, his manager said when questioned. But the way she said it, with her eyes darting to the floor and her voice a touch too rehearsed, made my stomach churn. It wasn't long before the disappearances became a pattern. One by one, employees began vanishing without a trace. At first it was easy to rationalize. The corporate world was cutthroat, and people came and went all the time. But the frequency of the resignations and the eerie silence surrounding them was impossible to ignore. What struck me the most was how seamlessly the company moved on, as if these people had never existed. Their roles were quietly absorbed by others, their contributions erased from conversations and records. Even the most outspoken employees, the ones you'd expect to question things, remained silent, their expressions carefully neutral. It was as if some unspoken rule forbade anyone from acknowledging the disappearances. Danny and I couldn't ignore it. "Something's going on," he said one evening as we sat in the break room, the office eerily quiet around us. "It's not normal. People don't just vanish like this." "I know," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. "But what can we do? No one else seems to care." Danny shook his head, his expression grim. "They care. They're just too scared to say anything. Look at them. Look at their eyes. They know something's wrong." And he was right. The fear was there, etched into the faces of my coworkers. It was in the way they avoided Adrian's gaze, the way they kept their voices low in meetings, the way they hurried out of the office as soon as the clock struck 5. The turning point came when Evelyn, one of Adrian's personal assistants, disappeared. Evelyn was sharp, efficient, and fiercely loyal to the company. She had been with Kramick Enterprises for over a decade, earning the respect and admiration of everyone who worked with her. One day, she was coordinating a high-profile event for Adrian, her usual composed self. The next, her office was empty, her nameplate removed from the door. No one dared to ask where she had gone. I saw her go into Adrian's office the night before she disappeared, Danny told me. His voice was shaky, his hands trembling as he gripped his coffee cup. She looked nervous, like she knew something was about to happen. "And you didn't say anything?" I asked, my frustration boiling over. "To who?" Danny snapped. "You think anyone here would listen? You think they'd do anything? You've seen how it is. This place, it's like it eats people." His words sent a chill down my spine. After Evelyn's disappearance, the atmosphere in the office shifted. The fear that had always lingered beneath the surface became palpable, suffocating. Conversations grew shorter, laughter vanished, and the already sterile environment felt even colder. I began noticing other strange things. Employees whispering in hushed tones, their eyes darting nervously around the room. The security team seemed to double overnight, their presence looming and oppressive. And then there was Adrian, who remained as composed and enigmatic as ever, his piercing blue eyes betraying nothing. Late one night while working overtime, I decided to investigate. The office was deserted, the only sound the hum of the air conditioning. I made my way to the file storage room, hoping to find some record of the missing employees. What I found instead was a locked cabinet, its surface scratched and dented, as if someone had tried to force it open. I jimmied the lock with a paperclip, my heart racing as the latch gave way. Inside were files, dozens of them, each labeled with the name of an employee who had disappeared. Flipping through the files, I felt a growing sense of dread. The documents contained detailed records of each employee's time at Kramik Enterprises, but they ended abruptly, as if their existence had been cut off. There were no termination letters, no exit interviews, just an empty void where their stories should have been. And then I found Evelyn's file. At the bottom of the stack, it was thinner than the others, as if most of its contents had been removed. But one piece of paper remained, a memo addressed to Adrian, marked with a cryptic symbol I didn't recognize. The memo contained a single line of text. "The arrangement has been fulfilled." I stared at the words, my hands trembling. What arrangement? Who had written this? And what had Adrian done to Evelyn? And the others? I didn't have answers, but I knew one thing for certain. This was no ordinary company. Kramik Enterprises was hiding something dark, something sinister, and Adrian Voss was at the center of it all. The disappearances weren't coincidences. They weren't resignations or transfers or anything else the company wanted us to believe. They were sacrifices. And I was terrified that Danny or I would be next. It was a night I'll never forget. A night that changed everything. I had stayed late in the office, determined to finish a report that was due the next morning. The building was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that made every creak of the floor and hum of the air conditioning feel amplified. The rest of the staff had long since gone home, leaving me alone in the dimly lit halls of Kramik Enterprises. Or so I thought. Around midnight I heard it. The faint rhythmic sound that Danny had described to me in whispers so many times before. Chanting. It was low and guttural, almost animalistic, and it sent a shiver down my spine. At first, I thought it was my imagination, a trick of the mind brought on by exhaustion and paranoia. But as I listened, the sound grew louder, more distinct. It was coming from the top floor. from Adrian's office. My heart pounded in my chest as I stood frozen at my desk, torn between the primal urge to flee and the insatiable curiosity that had brought me this far. Danny's warnings echoed in my mind, but so did the memory of the unmarked files, the disappearances, the cryptic memo I'd found in Evelyn's file. I had to know the truth. I made my way to the stairwell, my footsteps silent on the carpeted floor. The chanting grew louder with each step, filling the air with a sense of dread that seemed to seep into my very bones. It wasn't just the sound, it was the feeling it created. A heavy, oppressive energy that pressed down on me like a physical weight. When I reached the top floor, the chanting was deafening. The hallway was bathed in shadows, the only light coming from the faint, flickering glow seeping out from beneath the door to Adrian's office. I crept closer, every nerve in my body on edge, and pressed myself against the wall next to the door. The chanting stopped abruptly, plunging the hallway into an eerie silence. My breath caught in my throat as I leaned forward, peeking through the narrow crack in the door. What I saw was beyond anything I could have imagined. Adrian and his inner circle stood in a perfect circle, their bodies cloaked in flowing black robes that shimmered faintly in the dim light. The air in the room seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy, the walls vibrating ever so slightly as if responding to some unseen force. In the center of the circle was an employee, a young man I recognized from the IT department, bound and gagged, his eyes wide with terror. Adrian stepped forward, his movements slow and deliberate. He held a leather-bound book in his hands, its cover marked with strange symbols that seemed to shift and writhe as I looked at them. He opened the book, his lips moving silently as he read from its pages. The room was dimly lit by a blood-red glow emanating from an ornate symbol etched into the floor. The light seemed to move, flickering like fire, but there were no flames, only an unnatural, pulsating radiance that filled the air with an acrid, metallic scent. And Rin's voice rose, low and commanding, speaking words in a language I didn't recognize. The sound was hypnotic, each syllable carrying a weight that made my chest tighten. The other cloaked figures joined in, their voices blending into a chilling harmony that seemed to resonate deep within the walls. The young man in the center of the circle thrashed against his bindings, his muffled cries growing more desperate with each passing moment. Adrian raised his hands, and the chanting reached a crescendo. The glow from the floor intensified, bathing the room in an otherworldly light that made my vision blur and my head spin. Then, in one swift motion, Adrian produced a ceremonial dagger from beneath his robe. The blade was ornate, its surface etched with the same shifting symbols that adorned the book. Without hesitation, he plunged the dagger into the young man's chest. I stifled a scream, my hand clamped over my mouth as I watched the life drain from the man's eyes, The air grew thick with the metallic scent of blood, and the red glow from the floor flared brightly, casting twisted shadows on the walls. As the young man's body went limp, the glow began to coalesce, rising from the floor in a swirling column of light and shadow. The chanting stopped abruptly, and for a moment there was nothing but silence. Then Adrian spoke, his voice low and reverent. "The offering has been accepted." The swirling light faded, leaving the room in darkness save for the flickering glow of a single candle on Adrian's desk. The other figures lowered their hoods, revealing faces that were pale and expressionless, their eyes glinting with an unnatural light. I stumbled back from the door, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. My mind raced as I tried to process what I had just witnessed. It wasn't just a ritual, it was a sacrifice. And Adrian Voss, the man who commanded the respect and admiration of everyone at Kramik Enterprises, was at the center of it all. I fled down the stairs, my footsteps echoing in the empty halls. I didn't stop until I was outside, the cold night air hitting me like a slap to the face. My hands were shaking, my heart pounding as I tried to catch my breath. I knew then that Danny had been right all along. Adrian wasn't just hiding something, he was hiding something monstrous, something evil. And I was in way over my head. The next morning I arrived at the office, my mind still reeling from what I had witnessed the night before. I had barely slept, haunted by the image of Adrian standing in that circle, the flickering red light casting shadows that seemed alive. Every sound in the office felt amplified, every glance from a coworker suspicious. The normal buzz of morning activity seemed muted, drowned out by the memory of that chilling chant echoing in my ears. Danny was waiting for me at my desk. His face was pale, his usual spark of humor replaced by a grim intensity that stopped me in my tracks. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low and urgent. He didn't wait for my response, grabbing my arm and pulling me toward the break room. Once the door was closed behind us, he turned to face me, his eyes searching mine. "I know what you saw," he said, his voice trembling. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. "What are you talking about?" I replied, trying to play dumb, though the fear in my voice betrayed me. "Don't do that," Danny snapped, his tone sharper than I'd ever heard. "I know you stayed late last night. I know you went up to the top floor, and I know you saw them." I swallowed hard, the walls of denial I had tried to build crumbling in an instant. "I don't know what I saw," I muttered, my voice barely above a whisper. Danny shook his head, his expression dark. "You know exactly what you saw. You just don't want to believe it." He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Adrian and his people. They're not human." And I let out a nervous laugh, the absurdity of his words clashing with the undeniable terror clawing at the edges of my mind. "Come on, Danny," I said, forcing a weak smile. "That's crazy. You can't seriously believe—" "They're vampires," he interrupted, his voice cutting through my protests like a blade. The word hung in the air between us, heavy and suffocating. For a moment I could only stare at him, my mind racing. Vampires? It was ridiculous, impossible, and yet as I looked into Danny's eyes, I saw no hint of doubt, no trace of humor. He was dead serious. "I've been trying to figure it out for weeks," Danny continued, his voice rising with a mix of fear and frustration. "The disappearances, the late-night meetings, the way people act around Adrian, it all makes sense now. They're not just running a company, they're feeding—" I felt a chill run down my spine, the words sinking in despite my desperate attempts to reject them. "Feeding?" I repeated, my voice shaking. Danny nodded, his face grim. "Think about it. The disappearances always happen after someone gets called up to Adrian's office late at night. The files, the secrecy, it's all connected. They're not leaving the company, they're being drained." The room seemed to tilt around me, the weight of his words threatening to crush me. I wanted to argue, to tell him he was wrong, but the memories of what I had seen the night before were seared into my mind. The chanting, the blood-red light, the dagger, it all fit in a horrifying, twisted way. "You don't know that," I said weakly, clinging to the last shreds of denial. Danny's expression hardened. "I do," he said firmly. "And so do you. You just don't want to admit it. But if you keep pretending this isn't real, you're going to end up like the others." I felt a surge of anger, born out of fear and frustration. "Why are you telling me this now?" I demanded. "If you've known all along, why didn't you say something sooner?" "Because I didn't have proof," Danny shot back, his voice cracking with emotion. "And even if I did, who would believe me? This isn't some stupid horror movie, okay? This is real, and people like us don't get to fight back. We either keep our heads down, or we disappear." The room fell silent, the gravity of his words settling over us like a heavy fog. I could see the fear in his eyes, the way his hands trembled as he gripped the edge of the table. He wasn't just warning me, he was pleading with me to listen. "What do we do?" I asked finally, my voice barely audible. Danny hesitated, his gaze darting toward the door as if he expected someone to burst in at any moment. "We stay quiet," he said. "We keep our heads down, do our jobs, and hope they don't notice us. But whatever you do, don't go digging any deeper. Adrian and his people, they'll stop at nothing to protect their secret." His words sent a chill down my spine, the weight of their implications pressing down on me. I wanted to believe he was wrong, that there was some other explanation for everything we had seen and experienced, but deep down I knew he was right. As I left the break room and returned to my desk, I felt a pair of eyes on me, Glancing up, I saw Adrian standing in the doorway of his office, his piercing blue gaze fixed on me. His expression was unreadable, his smile cold and calculating. For the first time, I believed Danny. Adrian wasn't human, and I was terrified that he knew I was beginning to uncover the truth. It happened so suddenly, so quietly, that it almost felt like a bad dream. One day Danny was there, joking about how terrible the office coffee was, sharing theories about what Adrian and his inner circle were up to, and the next, he was gone. I knew something was wrong the moment I walked into the office that morning. His desk, usually cluttered with notes, coffee mugs, and stray pens, was completely empty. The monitor was off, the chair pushed neatly under the desk as if no one had ever sat there, a sharp contrast to the vibrant chaos that had always been Danny's workspace. The pit in my stomach deepened when I asked around. "Where's Danny?" I asked a co-worker who sat nearby. They barely looked up from their screen. "Oh, didn't you hear? He quit. Packed up last night and left. Didn't even say goodbye." Quit? That didn't make any sense. Danny wouldn't just leave without telling me, without giving me any warning. We had plans to meet up after work to talk more about Adrian and the things we'd uncovered. He'd been cautious, sure, but he wasn't the type to just vanish without a word. I tried to rationalize it, telling myself that maybe he had decided it was safer to walk away, to distance himself from the nightmare we'd been caught in. But deep down, I knew the truth. Danny hadn't left on his own. I spent the morning in a daze, replaying our last conversation in my mind. He had been nervous, more so than usual, but he hadn't mentioned anything about leaving. In fact, he had seemed more determined than ever to figure out what was really going on. "We're close to something," he had said, his voice low and urgent. "I can feel it, but we have to be careful. They're watching us." Now he was gone. The official story was that he had quit without notice, but the cracks in that narrative were glaring. No one had seen him leave. There were no farewell emails, no resignation letter, no formal announcement from HR. It was as if he had been erased overnight, his existence wiped clean from the company's records. I tried to access his files, hoping to find some clue about what had happened, but his account had been locked. His name was gone from the directory, his email address deactivated. Even his ID badge, which had been clipped to his desk the day before, was missing. Panic set in as I realized how thorough the erasure was. It wasn't just that Danny had left, it was as if he had never existed. I decided to check with Clara, the HR manager, hoping to get more information. Her office was as immaculate as ever, the shelves lined with neatly organized binders and the faint scent of lavender lingering in the air. "Clara," I began, trying to keep my voice steady. "I heard Danny quit. Do you know why? It's just so sudden." She looked up from her computer, her expression unreadable. "I'm afraid I can't discuss personnel matters," she said smoothly, her tone detached. "Come on," I pressed, forcing a nervous laugh. "It's me. We were friends. I want to make sure he's okay." For a moment, Clara's mask slipped. Her eyes flickered with something. Unease, perhaps. Or maybe guilt. But it was gone as quickly as it had appeared, replaced by her usual professional demeanor. "Danny made his decision," she said, her voice colder now. "We wish him the best." It was a lie. I could feel it in my gut. I left her office feeling more unsettled than ever. Everywhere I turned, I hit a wall of silence. Coworkers avoided my questions, their eyes darting nervously away whenever I mentioned Danny's name. The few who did respond simply repeated the same story. He quit. That was it. End of discussion. But I knew better. Danny had been digging too deep, asking too many questions. He had been the only one brave enough to confront the truth, and now he was gone. As the day wore on, my paranoia grew. I felt eyes on me constantly, shadowy presences lurking just out of sight. Every creak of the floor, every flicker of the lights, every muffled conversation in the hall sent my heart racing. I started to wonder if I was next. That evening I stayed late, determined to find answers. I combed through old emails, security logs, anything that might give me a clue about what had happened to Danny. But every lead I found seemed to disappear into a black hole. Files were missing, emails deleted, security footage wiped clean. It was as if someone had gone to great lengths to cover their tracks. Then I remembered the hidden cabinet in the storage room, the one where I had found the files on the missing employees. Heart pounding, I made my way to the basement, the dimly lit corridor stretching out before me like the mouth of a cave. The cabinet was still there, but when I opened it, my stomach dropped. The files were gone. All of them. The shelves were empty, save for a single sheet of paper lying at the bottom of the drawer. I picked it up with trembling hands. It was blank, except for one line scrawled in red ink. "Stay out of this." I stumbled back, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. Whoever had taken Danny wasn't just watching, they were sending me a message. I left the office that night feeling more alone than ever. Danny had been my anchor, the one person I could trust in this nightmare, and now he was gone. I didn't know where he was or if he was even alive, but I swore to myself that I wouldn't let his disappearance go unanswered. I would find out the truth, no matter what it cost me. But as I lay awake in bed that night, staring at the ceiling and listening to every creak and whisper in the dark, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was already too late. Danny wasn't just gone. He had been taken, and I was next. The day after Danny's disappearance, I couldn't shake the heavy feeling in my chest. The office felt colder, quieter, as if it were holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Every corner seemed darker, every shadow longer. Even the hum of the air conditioning seemed muted, as though the building itself knew something was terribly wrong. Danny was gone, but his presence still lingered in subtle ways, the ghost of his laughter echoing in the break room, the faint scent of his aftershave near his desk. I felt lost without him, but I knew one thing for sure. Danny wouldn't have left without leaving me something. He was too smart, too careful. If he had uncovered something dangerous, he would have documented it. So, with my heart pounding and my hands trembling, I waited until everyone had left for the evening. Then, under the dim glow of my desk lamp, I approached Danny's workstation. His desk looked as pristine as the day he started Early So. Someone had gone to great lengths to erase every trace of him, but they had underestimated Danny's knack for hiding things. I started with the obvious: drawers, folders, the small lockbox he kept under his monitor. Nothing. All of it had been cleared out, leaving behind only a sterile, empty workspace. Frustration bubbled up inside me, but I forced myself to think like Danny. He had always been one step ahead, always meticulous. If he had left something behind, it wouldn't be in plain sight. Then I remembered his habit of slipping things into the lining of his desk drawers. It was a trick he'd picked up in college when he was paranoid about roommates snooping through his stuff. Kneeling down, I ran my fingers along the underside of the drawer, feeling for the telltale crease. There it was. I tugged at the loose edge, and the thin lining peeled away to reveal a small leather-bound journal wedged into the hollow space. My breath caught as I pulled it out, the cover warm to the touch despite the cold air in the office. The journal was simple, unmarked, but as I flipped through the pages, I realized it was anything but ordinary. Danny had been keeping a detailed account of everything. His suspicions about Adrian, the disappearances, the strange late-night rituals. Page after page was filled with his neat, hurried handwriting, interspersed with crude sketches of symbols and diagrams. The first entries were cautious, almost hesitant. He wrote about Adrian's nocturnal habits, how he rarely attended morning meetings and seemed to thrive under the harsh fluorescent lights late at night. There were mentions of employees who had been called to Adrian's office after hours and were never seen again. Danny had documented dates, times, and even snippets of overheard conversations, piecing together a puzzle that no one else had dared to see. As I read further, the tone of the entries shifted. The cautious curiosity gave way to outright fear. Danny had uncovered rumors of an ancient vampire clan, one that had existed for centuries, feeding on the powerful and influential to maintain their hold on the world. According to his notes, Kramik Enterprises was more than just a corporation. It was a front, a carefully constructed facade that allowed Adrian and his associates to operate in plain sight. One entry sent a chill down my spine. The disappearances aren't random. They're sacrifices. Adrian and his people, vampires, cultists, whatever they are, they need blood to maintain their power. It's not just about feeding, it's about control. And now, I think they're watching me. I've seen Victoria following me, her eyes too sharp, too knowing. Adrian plans to make me the next sacrifice. I can feel it. My hands trembled as I read the words. Danny had known. He had seen it coming, and he had tried to warn me in his own way. The later entries were more frantic, the handwriting messier, the pages smudged as if they had been written in a hurry. He described the symbols he had seen in Adrian's office, the strange language of the chants, and the blood-red glow that seemed to emanate from the very walls. He wrote about the security team, how they weren't just guards but enforcers, keeping prying eyes away from the top floor. One entry stood out among the chaos, written in bold letters that practically screamed off the page. Do not trust anyone. Beneath it, Danny had scrawled a list of names. Co-workers, managers, even members of HR. All of them were marked with question marks, except for Adrian and his inner circle. Their names were circled in red, underlined with a single chilling note. Confirmed. I felt the air grow colder as I flipped to the final pages. The last entry was brief, written in shaky handwriting that barely resembled Danny's usual neat script. They know. Adrian smiled at me today, and I swear he knew everything. I don't have much time. If you're reading this, it means they've already gotten to me. Be careful. Don't let them see you digging. They'll stop at nothing to protect their secret. And whatever you do, stay away from the top floor at midnight. The journal slipped from my hands, landing on the desk with a dull thud. My chest felt tight, my breathing shallow as the reality of Danny's words sank in. He had been right about everything. Adrian wasn't just a ruthless CEO. He was something far more dangerous, something I could barely comprehend. I sat there for what felt like hours, the weight of the journal pressing down on me like a physical force. Danny had risked everything to uncover the truth, and now he was gone. But he had left me a map, a guide to the darkness lurking within Kramik Enterprises, and as terrifying as it was, I knew I couldn't ignore it. I closed the journal and slipped it into my bag, my mind racing with possibilities. Danny had been silenced, but his words had survived, and now it was up to me to decide what to do with them. As I left the office that night, the shadows seemed darker, the silence heavier. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that Adrian's piercing blue eyes were following me even in the darkness. But no matter how terrified I was, one thing was clear. Danny's disappearance wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. After finding Danny's journal, there was no going back. His warnings echoed in my mind with every step I took, every breath I drew. Don't let them see you digging. But staying quiet wasn't an option. Adrian was a monster, and I needed to know just how deep his darkness ran. It started with the public records. Late one evening, I sat at my kitchen table, the glow of my laptop illuminating the pages of notes scattered around me. Adrian Voss had always been an enigma, a man who appeared seemingly out of nowhere and rose to power faster than anyone else in the business world. His story was the kind of thing that reporters loved. The self-made billionaire with a knack for innovation and an uncanny ability to stay ahead of the competition. But the more I searched, the more I realized how little there actually was about him. The official record said he founded Kramic Enterprises 20 years ago, but beyond that his trail grew murky. There were no childhood photos, no mentions of family or hometowns. Even his early business ventures seemed shrouded in mystery, with vague mentions of partnerships that had dissolved, or rivals who had vanished without a trace. Thin mystery. I turned to historical records, scouring old census documents, photographs, and business directories. His face appeared again and again, sometimes slightly altered but always recognizable if you knew what to look for. In one grainy photograph from the 1840s, he stood in front of a crumbling manor, his piercing eyes glaring at the camera. Another showed him at a lavish gala in the 1890s, surrounded by powerful figures of the time. But it wasn't just his longevity that terrified me, it was his connections. I found references to a secret society, whispered about in conspiracy theories and forgotten corners of the internet. The Brotherhood of the Crimson Flame, they called it. A cult that had supposedly existed for centuries, worshipping ancient, bloodthirsty deities in exchange for power and immortality. According to the legends, the Brotherhood operated in the shadows, infiltrating governments, corporations, and influential circles to maintain their grip on the world. Adrian wasn't just a vampire, he was their leader. Danny's notes started making even more sense as I pieced together the horrifying puzzle. The sacrifices weren't just for sustenance, they were rituals, offerings to whatever dark forces Adrian served. The disappearances, the chanting, the symbols, all of it was part of a larger, twisted design. I began to notice the same symbols cropping up in the records I uncovered. They were carved into the walls of abandoned buildings, etched into old manuscripts, even subtly woven into the logos of companies Adrian had controlled. A blood-red crescent, encircled by jagged lines that seemed to shift and twist when you stared at them too long. And then I found the name, Malakvaris. The name appeared in several accounts, always associated with the Brotherhood's rituals. Some sources described Malakvaris as a god, others as a demon, but all agreed on one thing: it demanded blood. The Brotherhood believed that through these sacrifices they could gain power, wealth, and immortality, and Adrian was their high priest. I felt sick as I stared at the name, its jagged letters burning into my brain. This wasn't just about Adrian. It wasn't just about Kramic Enterprises. It was something far bigger, something far darker than I could have ever imagined. But the deeper I dug, the more dangerous it became. One night, as I sifted through yet another stack of old articles, I heard a noise outside my apartment. A faint rustling, followed by the unmistakable creak of floorboards. My breath caught in my throat as I reached for the nearest object, a heavy lamp, to defend myself. But when I flung open the door, there was no one there. Only the faint scent of lavender lingering in the air. The message was clear. They knew. From that moment on, I was constantly on edge. I stopped sleeping, afraid of what might happen if I let my guard down. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every stranger's gaze felt like a warning. I knew Adrian's reach extended far beyond the walls of Kramik Enterprises, and the closer I got to the truth, the more precarious my position became. But I couldn't stop. I had to know how far his darkness reached. I had to know what had happened to Danny, to Evelyn, to all the others who had disappeared. Adrian wasn't invincible. He had weaknesses, secrets that could be used against him. And if I could find them, maybe, just maybe, I could stop him. The question was, how much longer could I dig before I became his next victim? It started with a hunch, a feeling I couldn't shake after days of piecing together clues from Danny's journal and the records I had unearthed about Adrian. Kramik Enterprises was more than a corporation. It was a facade, a mask hiding something ancient, something evil. And I knew deep in my gut that the truth wasn't in Adrian's office or the pristine conference rooms. It was somewhere deeper, somewhere hidden. The basement. I had never given much thought to the lower levels of the building. Employees joked about how no one ever seemed to go down there. But now that I thought about it, the joke felt more like an unspoken rule. Don't ask questions about the basement. That evening, after the last of my coworkers had gone home, I made my move. The silence in the building was oppressive, the hum of the fluorescent lights above only amplifying the pounding of my heart. I had to force myself to walk slowly, to keep my footsteps light as I made my way to the stairwell that led to the basement. The door to the basement was heavy, its metal frame cold to the touch. I hesitated for a moment, 1,000 warnings screaming in my head to turn back, to leave this alone. But I couldn't. I had to know. The air changed as soon as I stepped inside. It was colder, damper, with a faint metallic scent that made my stomach churn. The stairwell was poorly lit, the weak glow of a single flickering bulb casting eerie shadows on the cracked concrete walls. With each step I took, the weight of the silence grew heavier, as if the building itself was holding its breath. When I reached the bottom, I found myself in a narrow hallway lined with storage rooms. Most of the doors were locked, their rusted handles looking as though they hadn't been touched in years. But as I moved deeper into the corridor, I noticed something odd. One of the doors was slightly ajar, a faint glow spilling out from the crack. I approached cautiously, every instinct in my body screaming at me to turn around. The door creaked as I pushed it open, revealing what appeared to be a janitor's closet, at least, at first glance. Shelves lined the walls, cluttered with cleaning supplies and tools, but something about the room felt wrong. That's when I noticed it. A small, barely noticeable seam in the back wall, its edges marked by faint scratches as though someone or something had tried to conceal it. My hands trembled as I ran my fingers along the seam, pressing gently until I felt a slight give. A hidden latch. The wall shifted with a low groan, revealing a dark passageway that descended even deeper into the earth. A cold draft hit me as I peered inside, carrying with it the faint scent of decay. I hesitated for a moment, gripping the flashlight I had brought with me as I took a deep breath and stepped into the darkness. The passage was narrow, the walls damp and rough, carved from ancient stone. Strange symbols were etched into the surface, their jagged lines glowing faintly as if alive. I recognized some of them from Danny's journal, the same symbols he had described seeing in Adrian's office. My flashlight flickered as I made my way down the winding corridor, the air growing colder with every step. The metallic scent grew stronger, mingling with a faint, acrid tang that burned my nostrils. I forced myself to keep moving, even as my legs threatened to give out beneath me. Finally, the passage opened into a cavernous chamber, and what I saw stopped me dead in my tracks. The walls were covered in the same glowing symbols, their light pulsating rhythmically like a heartbeat. Ancient tapestries hung from the ceiling, depicting scenes of blood and fire, of shadowy figures bowing before a monstrous entity. The floor was uneven, its surface stained with dark streaks that could only be dried blood. And in the center of the room stood the altar. It was massive, carved from a single slab of black stone that seemed to drink in the light around it. Its surface was slick, as if freshly polished, but when I stepped closer, I realized it was coated in a thin layer of dried blood. Grooves and channels had been etched into the stone, forming intricate patterns that converged in a small, hollowed-out basin. This was where the sacrifices happened. I felt a wave of nausea as the realization hit me, my stomach twisting at the thought of what had taken place here. The basin in the center of the altar still held a faint red residue, and the grooves leading into it were dark with congealed blood. Behind the altar, a large ornate symbol was carved into the wall, a crescent encircled by jagged lines, its surface glowing with the same eerie light as the symbols on the walls. It was the same symbol I had seen in the old records, the one associated with the Brotherhood of the Crimson Flame. As I stared at the altar, I could almost hear the echoes of the chants I had heard outside Adrian's office that night. The room seemed to hum with an energy that made my skin crawl, as if the very walls were alive, watching, waiting. I forced myself to look around, searching for anything that could tell me more about the rituals that had taken place here. In one corner of the chamber, I found a small table cluttered with artifacts, ceremonial daggers, aged scrolls, and vials filled with an unidentifiable black liquid. One scroll caught my attention, its edges frayed with age. Unfurling it, I found more symbols along with a diagram of the altar and what appeared to be instructions for the ritual. The words were written in a language I didn't recognize, but the images were clear enough. Figures bound and laid across the altar, their blood channeled into the basin as the surrounding participants raised their hands in worship. I felt a lump rise in my throat as I realized the scope of what Adrian and his followers were doing. These weren't just murders, they were offerings, sacrifices made to something far more sinister than I had imagined. A noise behind me snapped me out of my thoughts, a faint shuffling sound, like footsteps on stone. My heart leaped into my throat as I spun around, my flashlight darting across the chamber. But there was no one there. I backed away slowly, the weight of the room pressing down on me as I tried to steady my breathing. My mind raced with questions. How many people had died here? How long had this been going on? And most importantly, what was Adrian planning next? As I made my way back up the passage, the symbols on the walls seemed to glow brighter, their jagged lines almost mocking me. I could feel the weight of the altar's presence even as I left the chamber behind, its dark energy clinging to me like a second skin. I knew then that I had crossed a line, that there was no going back. I had seen too much, learned too much. And now, the darkness of Kramik Enterprises wasn't just a distant threat, it was personal. The question wasn't whether Adrian would come after me. The question was when. After what I had seen in the hidden chamber beneath Kramik Enterprises, I knew I couldn't face this alone. The scope of Adrian's evil was overwhelming and ancient, calculated force that had existed for centuries, feeding on the innocent and leaving destruction in its wake. I needed help. Someone who not only believed in the supernatural but also had the knowledge and courage to fight it. That's when I remembered Father Marcus. He wasn't your typical priest. Father Marcus was a legend in certain circles, a man of faith, yes, but also an expert in the occult. He had spent decades studying ancient texts, unraveling the mysteries of forgotten rituals, and confronting the darkest corners of human belief. Stories about him bordered on the mythical, exorcisms in remote villages, encounters with things that defied explanation, and a deep understanding of forces most people refused to acknowledge. Finding him wasn't easy. Father Marcus lived off the grid, his exact whereabouts known only to a select few. It took days of research, digging through obscure forums and old news articles, but eventually I found a lead: a small, secluded church on the outskirts of town, far from the prying eyes of the modern world. The church was as unassuming as it was isolated, its weathered stone facade hidden by a dense thicket of trees. I arrived just as the sun was setting, the fading light casting long shadows across the grounds. The air was heavy with the scent of incense and damp earth, and an unsettling stillness hung over the place, as though it existed in a world apart from the one I knew. Inside, the church was dimly lit, the flickering glow of candles casting eerie patterns on the walls. Father Marcus was kneeling at the altar, his back to me, his broad shoulders hunched in prayer. He was older than I had expected, his hair streaked with gray, his face lined with the weight of years spent battling forces most people couldn't comprehend. "Father Marcus," I called hesitantly, my voice echoing in the silence. He turned slowly, his piercing eyes meeting mine. There was a sharpness to his gaze, a quiet intensity that made me feel as though he could see straight into my soul. "You're not here for confession," he said, his voice deep and steady. "What do you want?" I hesitated, the weight of my fear threatening to choke me. "I need your help," I said finally. "It's about Adrian Voss." For a moment there was no response. Then Father Marcus's expression darkened. "I've heard the name," he said. "Rumors mostly. But if half of what they say is true," he trailed off, shaking his head. "What do you know?" I didn't waste time explaining. Instead, I pulled Danny's journal from my bag, along with the photographs I had taken of the underground chamber. I laid them out on the altar, the evidence stark and undeniable in the dim light. Father Marcus studied the items in silence, his brow furrowing as he flipped through the journal's pages. When he reached the photograph of the altar, he froze, his fingers tracing the jagged lines of the symbols etched into the stone. "This is older than I thought," he murmured, more to himself than to me. "These symbols, they're not just for rituals. They're markers, seals to channel power. And this," he tapped the photograph of the crescent symbol on the wall. "This is the mark of Malekveris." The name sent a shiver down my spine. I had read it in Danny's journal, seen it in the records I had uncovered. But hearing it spoken aloud, in Father Marcus's grave tone, made it feel even more real. "So you believe me?" I asked, my voice trembling. Father Marcus closed the journal and looked at me, his expression grim. "These creatures are pure evil," he said, "but they can be destroyed." Relief washed over me, though it was tempered by the gravity of his words. "How?" I asked, desperate for answers. Father Marcus turned away, pacing slowly as he spoke. "It won't be easy," he said. "Adrian Voss isn't just a vampire, he's a high priest of the Brotherhood of the Crimson Flame. That makes him more powerful, more dangerous than most. He's tied to Malekveris, and that connection gives him strength. but it's also his weakness. I frowned, struggling to understand. What do you mean? Father Marcus stopped and turned back to me, his eyes blazing with determination. The rituals, the sacrifices, they bind him to Maleficaris, but they also tether his power to this world. Destroy the altar, disrupt the rituals, and you sever that connection. Without it, Adrian is vulnerable. The plan sounded simple enough, but I knew it wouldn't be. Adrian wasn't just powerful, he was cunning, and his reach extended far beyond what I could comprehend. What about the others? I asked. His inner circle, they're vampires too, right? Father Marcus nodded. They'll protect him at all costs, and they're not bound by the same limitations as Adrian. They're faster, stronger, and they won't hesitate to kill. But they're not invincible. Holy water, blessed silver, fire, these things can harm them. And if you can separate them from Adrian, they'll be weaker without his influence. The enormity of what I was about to face hit me like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just about exposing Adrian or saving myself. It was about confronting an evil that had existed for centuries, an evil that had claimed countless lives, and would continue to do so unless it was stopped. Father Marcus seemed to sense my hesitation. He placed a hand on my shoulder, his grip firm but reassuring. "You're not alone in this," he said. "I've fought creatures like Adrian before. It won't be easy, but it's not impossible. And if we succeed, we'll be saving more lives than you can imagine." I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. "What do we do first?" Father Marcus smiled faintly, a glimmer of hope in his otherwise stern demeanor. "We prepare," he said. "This isn't just a battle of strength, it's a battle of faith and will. And if we're going to face Adrian Voss, we'll need both in abundance." As I left the church that night, the weight of my fear hadn't lessened, but it was joined by something else, a spark of determination. Father Marcus had given me hope, a path forward in the darkness. But deep down, I knew the hardest part was yet to come. Father Marcus and I spent hours poring over Danny's journal, the photographs of the chamber, and the cryptic notes I had compiled about Adrian and his inner circle. Every clue, every piece of evidence had to be scrutinized for weaknesses we could exploit. Adrian and his followers were meticulous, their rituals calculated and precise. But even the most cunning predators make mistakes, and we were going to find one. The plan had to be flawless. Adrian wasn't just a vampire, he was a leader, a symbol of an ancient and insidious order. Confronting him directly was out of the question. He was too powerful, too protected. Instead, we needed to expose him, to pull the veil off his carefully constructed facade and reveal the monster lurking beneath. But to do that, we needed evidence. And not just photographs or whispers of rumors, we needed something undeniable, something that would force even the most skeptical minds to see the truth. "We have to catch them in the act," Father Marcus said, his voice grim as he traced a finger over the map of the Kramik Enterprises building spread out on the table. "The altar, the sacrifices, it's all centered there. If we can record the ritual, document everything, we can destroy them from within." The thought of returning to that cursed chamber made my stomach churn, but I knew he was right. Adrian's power was rooted in secrecy, in the disbelief of those who couldn't fathom the existence of creatures like him. Exposing him would shatter that illusion, leaving him vulnerable. "How do we get back in without being caught?" I asked, my mind racing through the possibilities. Father Marcus tapped the map, his brow furrowed in thought. "The security system is extensive, but it's designed to keep outsiders out. If you're careful, you can move through the building unnoticed. The key is timing. The rituals take place at night when most of the staff is gone. That's when we strike. I nodded, though my pulse quickened at the thought. And the others? Adrian's inner circle? They'll be there. Father Marcus met my gaze, his expression steely. They will, he said, but they're not invincible. Holy water, blessed silver, fire will bring everything we have. And if it comes to a fight, we won't hesitate. The weight of his words settled over me like a shroud. This wasn't just a plan, it was a war. A battle for survival against creatures that had thrived in the shadows for centuries. And yet, despite my fear, a spark of determination burned within me. Adrian had taken Danny and countless others before him. I wouldn't let him take anyone else. Over the next few days, Father Marcus and I prepared meticulously. He blessed vials of holy water, sharpened stakes made of silver-tipped ash, and fashioned crude but effective crosses from iron and wood. He taught me how to wield them, showing me where to aim, how to strike. They're fast, stronger than you can imagine, he warned as we sparred in the dimly lit church. But they're overconfident. They think they're untouchable. Use that against them. At night, I returned to the office, pretending to work late while carefully observing the patterns of Adrian's associates. I memorized their routines, noting when they arrived, when they left, and who seemed to linger after hours. I found excuses to roam the building, mapping out the quickest routes to the basement and identifying potential hiding spots. The pressure was suffocating. Every glance, every sound felt like a threat. I couldn't shake the feeling that Adrian knew what I was doing, that his piercing blue eyes were always watching, waiting for me to make a mistake. But I couldn't stop. The stakes were too high. Finally, the night of the ritual arrived. Father Marcus and I arrived separately, our movements careful and deliberate. He entered through the back entrance of the church that connected to an old utility tunnel, a route he had discovered in his research. I slipped into the office as I always did, carrying a backpack filled with recording equipment and the tools Father Marcus had prepared. The building was eerily quiet, the usual hum of activity replaced by an oppressive silence. The air felt heavy, charged with an energy that made my skin crawl. I could feel it, the anticipation, the darkness gathering like a storm. I made my way to the basement, my footsteps muffled by the carpeted floors. Every corner felt like a threat, every shadow a potential ambush. When I reached the hidden passage, Father Marcus was already there, his face illuminated by the faint glow of his flashlight. "Are you ready?" he asked, his voice low but steady. I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. "Let's do this." We moved down the passage in silence, the walls seeming to close in around us as we descended into the heart of the chamber. The metallic scent of blood grew stronger, mingling with the faint, acrid tang of incense. The symbols on the walls glowed faintly, their jagged lines pulsing in rhythm with my racing heart. When we reached the chamber, we stopped just short of the entrance, crouching in the shadows. The room was bathed in that same blood-red glow, the altar at its center radiating an unnatural energy. Adrian stood at the head of the circle, his black cloak billowing around him like smoke. His associates flanked him, their expressions cold and unreadable as they prepared for the ritual. In the center of the altar lay the latest victim, a young man, bound and terrified, his muffled cries barely audible over the low hum of chanting that filled the air. Father Marcus and I exchanged a glance. This was it. Carefully, I set up the recording equipment, the small camera concealed in a crevice near the entrance. It wasn't perfect, but it would capture enough to expose the horrors of what was happening here. As the chanting reached its crescendo, Father Marcus stepped forward, holding a vial of holy water in one hand and a cross in the other. "Enough," he bellowed, his voice echoing through the chamber like a thunderclap. The room fell silent, all eyes turning toward us. Adrian's piercing gaze locked onto mine, a slow smile spreading across his face. "So," he said, his voice smooth and chilling, "you finally decided to join us." We moved down the passage in silence, the walls seeming to close in around us as we descended into the heart of the chamber. The metallic scent of blood grew stronger, mingling with the faint, acrid tang of incense. The symbols on the walls glowed faintly, their jagged lines pulsing in rhythm with my racing heart. When we reached the chamber, we stopped just short of the entrance, crouching in the shadows. The room was bathed in that same blood-red glow, the altar at its center radiating an unnatural energy. Adrian stood at the head of the circle, his black cloak billowing around him like smoke. His associates flanked him, their expressions cold and unreadable as they prepared for the ritual. In the center of the altar lay the latest victim, a young man, bound and terrified, his muffled cries barely audible over the low hum of chanting that filled the air. Father Marcus and I exchanged a glance. This was it. Carefully I set up the recording equipment, the small camera concealed in a crevice near the entrance. It wasn't perfect, but it would capture enough to expose the horrors of what was happening here. As the chanting reached its crescendo, Father Marcus stepped forward, holding a vial of holy water in one hand and a cross in the other. "Enough," he bellowed, his voice echoing through the chamber like a thunderclap. The room fell silent, all eyes turning toward us. Adrian's piercing gaze locked onto mine, a slow smile spreading across his face. "So," he said, his voice smooth and chilling, "you finally decided to join us." I felt my knees go weak, but Father Marcus stood firm, his presence a beacon of defiance in the oppressive darkness. "Your reign ends tonight," he said, his voice steady. "The light will expose your evil, and the innocent will no longer suffer under your shadow." Adrian's smile faded, replaced by a cold, calculating expression. "You've made a grave mistake, Father," he said, "but I admire your bravery. It's been a long time since anyone dared to challenge me." With a flick of his hand, Adrian signaled his associates, who began to close in on us. The fight had begun. The air that night felt heavier than usual, thick with the kind of tension that made every breath feel labored. It was the night of their next ritual, and Father Marcus and I were ready, or as ready as we could be. The past days had been a blur of preparation, our every waking moment consumed by the weight of what we were about to do. Adrian's followers would be gathering in the underground chamber beneath Kramik Enterprises, preparing to perform another sacrifice to their dark master, Malik Varus. But this time we would be waiting. We entered the building just after midnight, slipping in through the back entrance to avoid detection. The office was eerily quiet, the usual hum of machinery and fluorescent lights replaced by a suffocating stillness. Every shadow felt alive, every creak of the floorboards like a warning. Father Marcus led the way, his flashlight casting a narrow beam that barely pierced the darkness. He carried a small satchel filled with holy water, consecrated silver stakes, and a thick leather-bound book of exorcisms. I clutched the recording equipment and a crude iron cross he had fashioned for me, my palms slick with sweat. When we reached the hidden passage, Marcus turned to me, his eyes filled with determination. "Stay close," he whispered, "and remember, no matter what happens, do not lose your faith. It's the only thing keeping us alive tonight." I nodded, my heart pounding as we descended into the depths of the chamber. The metallic scent of blood hit me like a wave, sharper and more nauseating than before. The symbols on the walls glowed faintly, pulsing with an energy that seemed to resonate in my very bones. As we approached the entrance to the chamber, we stopped and crouched in the shadows, our breaths shallow and silent. The scene before us was almost identical to the last ritual I had witnessed. Adrian and his inner circle stood in a circle around the altar, their black robes flowing like liquid shadows. At the center of the circle lay their latest victim, a young woman bound and gagged, her eyes wide with terror. The blood-red glow of the altar bathed the room in an unholy light, casting twisted shadows on the walls. The air hummed with a low, guttural chant, the words ancient and incomprehensible. Adrian stood at the head of the circle, his piercing blue eyes glowing faintly as he held the ceremonial dagger aloft. His voice rose above the chant, commanding and hypnotic, as he called upon the dark powers he served. I felt a wave of nausea as I watched, my grip tightening on the cross in my hand. This was at the moment we had been preparing for. Father Marcus nodded to me, his expression grim but resolute. He reached into his satchel and pulled out the first vial of holy water, holding it tightly in one hand while clutching his cross in the other. Then, just as Adrian raised the dagger to strike, Marcus stepped forward. "Stop," he bellowed, his voice echoing through the chamber like thunder. The chanting stopped abruptly, the oppressive silence that followed almost deafening. Every head turned toward us, their eyes narrowing as they took in the sight of Father Marcus standing tall and defiant, his cross raised high. Adrian's expression darkened, his piercing gaze locking onto Marcus. For a moment he said nothing, his lips curling into a slow, predatory smile. "Ah," he said, his voice smooth and chilling. "The priest finally shows himself. I've been expecting you." Marcus didn't flinch. "Your reign of terror ends tonight, Adrian," he said, his voice steady. "You and your followers will face the judgment of the light." Adrian chuckled, a low, menacing sound that sent shivers down my spine. "Judgment," he said, tilting his head. "You think you can stop me with your little toys and prayers? I have lived for centuries, Father. I am eternal. And you," he gestured dismissively, "you are nothing." "We'll see about that," Marcus said. With a swift motion, he uncorked the vial of holy water and flung it toward Adrian. The liquid arced through the air, glinting in the blood-red light before splattering across Adrian's chest. The reaction was immediate. Adrian let out a guttural roar, his body convulsing as the holy water burned into his flesh like acid. The room erupted into chaos as his followers surged toward us, their faces contorted with rage and inhuman hunger. Marcus began to chant, his voice rising above the din as he recited a powerful exorcism. The words were ancient and resonant, each syllable carrying a weight that seemed to press against the walls of the chamber. The symbols on the walls flickered and dimmed, the glow of the altar faltering as Marcus's words filled the air. I backed away, clutching the iron cross tightly as one of Adrian's followers lunged toward me. The creature's eyes glowed red, its fangs bared as it snarled. With a desperate cry, I thrust the cross forward, the iron burning into its flesh and forcing it to retreat with a shriek. Marcus continued his chant, his voice unwavering even as the chaos around us intensified. Adrian staggered toward him, his glowing eyes blazing with fury. "You will pay for this," Adrian hissed, his voice distorted and guttural. Marcus didn't falter. He pulled a silver stake from his satchel and held it aloft, his chant reaching a crescendo. The altar began to crack, fissures spreading across its surface as the glow faded to a dim, flickering ember. The chamber shook violently, dust and debris raining down from the ceiling. Adrian's followers faltered, their movements sluggish and disoriented as the energy in the room began to dissipate. "This is your end, Adrian," Marcus shouted, his voice ringing with authority. With a final, triumphant cry, Marcus plunged the silver stake into the altar. The reaction was instantaneous. A blinding light erupted from the fissures, engulfing the chamber in a searing brilliance. Adrian let out an unearthly scream, his body writhing as the light consumed him. His followers collapsed to the ground, their forms dissolving into ash as the chamber trembled around us. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the light vanished. The chamber was silent, the oppressive energy that had filled it gone. The altar lay in ruins, its dark power extinguished. Adrian's body was nowhere to be seen, only a pile of ash remaining where he had stood. I turned to Marcus, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. He was leaning heavily on his cross, his face pale but triumphant. "It's over," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "For now." As we made our way out of the ruined chamber, I couldn't help but feel a sense of relief mixed with unease. We had stopped Adrian and his followers, but the darkness they served still lingered in the shadows. And I knew, deep down, that our fight was far from over. Just when we thought we had the upper hand, Adrian revealed his true form. It was as though the man we had come to fear was shedding the thin veneer of humanity he wore like a mask. The transformation was terrifying, swift, and brutal. His eyes glowed a deep, fiery red, the pupils narrowed to slits that seemed to pierce through flesh and bone. His once chiseled features contorted into something grotesque and animalistic, his skin pale and veined, as though it had been drained of life. His fangs, long and glistening with blood, emerged from his sneering mouth, catching the dim light of the ruined chamber. He was no longer trying to conceal the monster within, he was embracing it. The sight froze me where I stood. My body screamed at me to run, to flee from this abomination, but my feet remained rooted to the ground, as if weighed down by the sheer gravity of his presence. "You dare defile my sanctum," Adrian hissed, his voice layered with an otherworldly resonance that made the walls tremble. "You think your faith can stand against centuries of power?" Father Marcus stood firm, his cross raised high, the light from it glowing faintly in the oppressive darkness. "Your power is a facade," he said, his voice steady despite the menace before him. "And tonight it ends." Adrian laughed, a chilling, guttural sound that sent shivers down my spine. "You have no idea what you're dealing with, priest. I will enjoy tearing the faith from your flesh." With a guttural roar, Adrian lunged forward, his movements impossibly fast. Father Marcus reacted with the precision of a man who had faced darkness before. He flung a vial of holy water directly into Adrian's path. The liquid struck Adrian's chest, sizzling as it burned into his flesh. He howled in pain, staggering back, smoke rising from the wound. The chamber erupted into chaos. Adrian's associates, who had been lying in wait, revealed themselves, their forms shifting into ghastly creatures. Their faces twisted into snarling visages, their hands elongating into clawed appendages. They moved with inhuman speed, circling us like predators. Father Marcus didn't falter. Chanting prayers in a commanding voice, he hurled another vial of holy water at one of the creatures, the liquid exploding on contact and sending the beast writhing to the ground. He turned to me, his eyes filled with urgency. "Free the girl," he shouted. I'll hold them off. The girl. I had almost forgotten about her in the chaos. She was still bound to the altar, her muffled cries of terror barely audible over the cacophony. I nodded and sprinted toward her, dodging a clawed hand that swiped at me from the shadows. My heart pounded as I reached the altar, my hands fumbling with the ropes that bound her wrists and ankles. Her eyes, wide with fear, locked onto mine as I worked frantically to free her. "It's okay," I whispered, though my voice trembled. "I'm getting you out of here." Behind me, the battle raged on. Father Marcus stood his ground, his cross glowing brighter with each prayer he uttered. He threw another vial of holy water, the liquid splattering across two of Adrian's associates and sending them howling to the ground. One lunged at him, its claws slashing through the air, but Marcus deflected the blow with his cross, the creature recoiling as if struck by a physical force. Adrian, meanwhile, had recovered from the initial attack. His glowing eyes locked onto Marcus, fury radiating from every inch of his monstrous form. "You dare challenge me?" he bellowed, his voice reverberating through the chamber. "I dare to stand against evil," Marcus replied, his voice unwavering. Adrian lunged again, faster this time. Marcus barely had time to raise his cross, the force of Adrian's attack sending him staggering back. But he held firm, the holy symbol burning against Adrian's flesh as the vampire hissed in agony. I finally managed to untie the last of the girl's restraints. "Run," I told her, helping her to her feet. "Get out of here." She nodded, tears streaming down her face, and bolted toward the passageway. I turned back just in time to see one of Adrian's associates closing in on Marcus from behind. Without thinking, I grabbed a stake from the satchel Marcus had given me and hurled it with all my strength. The stake struck true, piercing the creature's chest. It let out a guttural screech, its body convulsing before collapsing into a pile of ash. Marcus glanced at me, a flicker of approval in his eyes. "Good work," he said. But Adrian was far from defeated. Snarling, he spread his arms wide, the air around him shimmering with a dark, malevolent energy. The remaining symbols on the walls flared to life, their jagged lines glowing blood red. The chamber trembled violently, dust and debris falling from the ceiling. "You think you've won?" Adrian roared, his voice filled with unholy power. "I am eternal. I am unstoppable." "No one is unstoppable," Marcus countered, his voice rising above the din. He pulled a final vial of holy water from his satchel and hurled it at the altar. The liquid splattered across its surface, the glow of the symbols dimming as the altar began to crack. Adrian howled in fury, his form flickering as though struggling to maintain its shape. Marcus pressed forward, his cross blazing with light as he chanted a final, powerful exorcism. The words seemed to tear through the air, each syllable resonating with a force that shook the chamber to its core. Adrian staggered back, his monstrous form writhing as the light from Marcus's cross engulfed him. "This is for every soul you've taken," Marcus said, his voice steady and resolute. "Your time is over." With a final, triumphant cry, Marcus drove the cross into the altar, the room erupting into blinding light. Adrian let out one last, blood-curdling scream as his body disintegrated, the light consuming him until nothing remained but ash. The remaining creatures collapsed, their forms dissolving into dust as the energy in the room dissipated. And then, silence. I stood there, breathing heavily, the iron cross still clutched in my hand. The chamber was dark now, the oppressive energy that had filled it gone. Marcus leaned heavily on the ruined altar, his face pale but victorious. "It's done," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, my chest tight with a mix of relief and exhaustion. "We did it," I said, though the words felt hollow. The cost had been high, the memories of what we had seen and done seared into my mind. As we made our way out of the chamber, I couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. Adrian was gone, but the darkness he had served still lingered, a shadow that would never fully fade. And I knew that this fight was only the beginning. The light from Father Marcus's cross blazed brightly, cutting through the oppressive darkness that had filled the chamber. Adrian writhed and screamed, his monstrous form flickering as though caught between this world and another. The air around him crackled with energy, the symbols on the walls dimming as their power waned. For a moment it seemed as though we had won. Adrian's glowing red eyes dulled, his clawed hands trembling as the strength drained from his body. He staggered back, his once imposing presence reduced to something almost vulnerable. But then, in a chilling moment that froze the air in the room, Adrian straightened. His face, though pale and twisted, bore a look of pure, unyielding hatred. His lips curled into a sneer, revealing those sharp, glistening fangs, and he fixed his piercing gaze on me. "You think this is the end?" he hissed, his voice low and venomous, layered with an eerie echo that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "You've only delayed the inevitable." Father Marcus, still gripping his glowing cross, stepped forward, his voice steady but firm. "Your power is broken, Adrian," he said. "You can't hide behind your rituals anymore. You've been exposed." Adrian laughed, a low, guttural sound that sent shivers down my spine. "Broken," he spat, his tone dripping with malice. "You haven't destroyed me, priest. You've merely scratched the surface. Do you think my power comes from this place alone? Do you think Malakvaris is so easily defeated?" The mention of Malakvaris sent a wave of nausea through me. The name alone carried a weight that was almost unbearable, a reminder of the dark forces Adrian served. "We've severed your connection to this place," Marcus countered, raising the cross higher. "You're vulnerable now, weakened. You won't recover from this." Adrian's eyes narrowed, his smile fading into a cold, calculating expression. "You've made a grave mistake," he said, his voice quieter now but no less menacing. "This isn't over. You've made an enemy for eternity." With that, Adrian began to retreat. His form seemed to shimmer and distort as he backed away, the edges of his body dissolving into wisps of shadow. It was as though he was unraveling, his power unable to hold him together in the wake of our attack. But before he disappeared completely, he turned to me. His glowing eyes bore into mine, and for a moment it felt as though he was looking straight into my soul. "I will remember you," he said, his voice soft but filled with a chilling promise. "And when the time comes, I will return. You will beg for mercy, and I will take everything you hold dear." Then, with one final guttural growl, he vanished into the shadows. The chamber fell silent, the oppressive energy that had hung over it dissipating like smoke. For a long moment, neither Marcus nor I spoke. The weight of what had just happened pressed down on us like a physical force, the reality of Adrian's warning sinking in. "He's gone," I said finally, though the words felt hollow. Marcus nodded, lowering his cross. "For now," he said, his voice weary. "But he's right about one thing: this isn't over." I looked around the chamber, taking in the ruined altar, the cracked walls, and the scattered remains of Adrian's followers. The symbols on the walls had faded completely, their once threatening glow reduced to nothing more than faint etchings. "We weakened him," I said, more to convince myself than anything else. "We stopped him from completing the ritual. That has to mean something, right?" Marcus sighed, his expression grim. "It means we've set him back," he said. "But Adrian isn't like other creatures of his kind. He's ancient cunning. He'll find another way to rebuild his power. And when he does, he'll come for us." The gravity of his words settled over me like a shroud. Adrian's warning echoed in my mind, a chilling reminder that our victory was only temporary. But even as fear threatened to take hold, I felt a spark of determination ignite within me. We had faced Adrian at his strongest, in the very heart of his power, and we had survived. More than that, we had weakened him, stripped him of the rituals and symbols that had sustained him for centuries. For the first time, Adrian's power was faltering, and that gave me hope. "What do we do now?" I asked, turning to Marcus. He looked at me, his expression softening ever so slightly. "Now," he said, "we prepare. Adrian may be gone for now, but there are others like him, others who serve the same darkness. This fight is far from over." I nodded, the weight of his words sinking in. The battle against Adrian had been a harrowing, life-altering experience, but it was clear that it was only the beginning. The world was darker than I had ever imagined, filled with forces that thrived in the shadows. But as terrifying as that thought was, it also gave me a sense of purpose. I had seen the truth, faced it head-on, and survived. And now, with Father Marcus by my side, I was determined to keep fighting. As we made our way out of the chamber, the faint scent of blood and decay lingering in the air, I couldn't help but glance back one last time. The ruined altar stood as a testament to what we had accomplished, but it also served as a reminder of the darkness that still loomed. Adrian's warning echoed in my mind as we stepped into the cool night air, the stars above shining faintly through the clouds. "This isn't over." And I knew deep down that he was right. But for the first time I wasn't afraid, because no matter how long it took, no matter how many battles lay ahead, I was ready. We had weakened him. And one day we would finish what we started. The air in the chamber felt colder than ever, as though Adrian's retreat had left a void that the earth itself refused to fill. Father Marcus and I stood in the silence, staring at the ruined altar. The once glowing symbols on the walls had faded into dark, lifeless etchings, their power extinguished. The oppressive energy that had filled this place was gone, but its memory lingered, a ghost that refused to let us forget the horrors we had witnessed. The decision to burn it all wasn't made lightly. This chamber had been a sanctuary of evil for centuries, a place where Adrian and his followers had spilled blood and traded lives for power. Leaving it intact felt like a betrayal of the lives that had been lost here. It wasn't enough to weaken Adrian's power, we had to destroy the source. "It's the only way," Father Marcus said, his voice low but resolute. "This place is a wound on the earth. It needs to be cleansed." I nodded, though my stomach churned at the thought. The chamber felt alive, as though it were watching us, waiting to see if we would truly have the courage to destroy it. Father Marcus reached into his satchel and pulled out a small container of holy oil. He began to walk the perimeter of the room, pouring the oil in a deliberate, unbroken line along the floor. The sharp scent filled the air, cutting through the metallic tang of dried blood and decay. As he worked, he murmured a quiet prayer, his words a steady rhythm that seemed to push back against the darkness. I followed behind him, carrying the bundle of kindling and accelerant we had brought with us. The chamber was vast, its jagged walls and low-hanging tapestries stretching into shadowy corners. It felt endless, as though the darkness extended far beyond what we could see. "Be thorough," Marcus said without looking up. "We can't leave anything behind." We moved methodically, setting up piles of wood and cloth at key points around the room. The altar, cracked and stained with the remnants of countless rituals, was our final focus. Its black stone surface seemed to absorb the light, refusing to reflect even the faintest glow from our flashlights. As we worked, I couldn't help but feel the weight of the lives that had been taken here. I thought of Danny, of the young woman we had freed, of all the nameless victims who had met their end on this cursed stone. Their presence was palpable, a silent chorus of pain and desperation that filled the air. "Do you think this will be enough?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Marcus paused, turning to look at me. His expression was weary but determined. "It has to be," he said. "This place is a conduit for Adrian's power. Without it, he'll be weaker, vulnerable." But he hesitated, his gaze drifting to the altar. "This won't end him. He'll rebuild, find another way. We've won a battle, but the war is far from over." His words sent a chill down my spine, but I forced myself to focus on the task at hand. We had to destroy this place, even if it was only a temporary victory. When the preparations were complete, Marcus stepped back and surveyed the room. The oil glistened faintly on the floor, and the piles of kindling stood ready to ignite. He pulled a small, ornate lighter from his pocket, its surface etched with a cross. "Are you ready?" he asked. I nodded, though my hands trembled. "Let's finish this." Marcus lit the first pile near the entrance, the flames catching quickly and climbing hungrily up the wood. The fire spread along the trail of holy oil, snaking its way around the room in a circle of light and heat. The tapestries ignited in bursts of flame, their ancient fabric curling and blackening as the fire consumed them. The air grew thick with smoke, the acrid scent stinging my eyes and throat. The chamber seemed to groan in protest, the walls trembling as the fire reached the altar. The black stone cracked and hissed, its surface splitting as the heat intensified. "Keep moving," Marcus shouted over the roar of the flames. We retreated toward the passageway, watching as the fire consumed everything in its path. The symbols on the walls flared briefly, their jagged lines glowing one last time before fading into nothingness. The altar, the heart of this dark place, crumbled under the assault of the flames, its power finally broken. As the fire roared behind us, I felt a strange mix of emotions. There was relief, yes, but also a profound sense of loss. This chamber had been a place of unimaginable evil, but it was also a reminder of how far Adrian's darkness had reached. Destroying it felt like severing a piece of his power, but it also felt like the closing of a chapter one wasn't ready to leave behind. We emerged from the passageway into the cool night air, our clothes damp with sweat and our lungs burning from the smoke. Behind us, the fire raged on, the glow of the flames visible even from outside. Marcus turned to me, his face illuminated by the flickering light. "It's done," he said, though his tone was heavy with exhaustion. I nodded, my gaze fixed on the entrance to the chamber. "It feels like we've won," I said. "But why does it feel unfinished?" Marcus sighed, his shoulders slumping. "Because it is," he said. "Adrian may be weakened, but he's not defeated. He'll come back, and when he does, he'll be more dangerous than ever." But for now, he placed a hand on my shoulder, his grip firm but reassuring. We've taken away his sanctuary. That's a victory worth holding on to. As we stood there, watching the flames consume the last remnants of Adrian's dark rituals, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. The fire was cleansing, yes, but it wasn't enough to extinguish the darkness entirely. Adrian's warning echoed in my mind, this isn't over. And I knew he was right. We had struck a blow against the evil that had festered here for centuries, but the fight was far from over. Adrian was still out there, waiting, plotting, and when he returned, it would be with a vengeance. But for now, as the flames roared and the chamber collapsed into ash and rubble, I allowed myself a moment of catharsis. We had fought back against the darkness and survived. And as daunting as the road ahead seemed, I knew we had the strength to face it. Because this time we were ready. The fire had consumed the chamber, destroying the altar, the symbols, and everything Adrian had used to channel his dark power. But as we stood outside, the glow of the flames fading into the night, I knew that wasn't the end. Adrian's physical sanctuary may have been destroyed, but his influence remained a web of lies and manipulation spun across the corridors of power. If we wanted to ensure Adrian couldn't recover, we needed to expose the truth about Kremik Enterprises, about him, and about the lives lost under his reign. Father Marcus and I returned to the church that night, our clothes reeking of smoke and our bodies exhausted, but our minds racing with plans. On the table before us lay the evidence we had risked everything to gather. Danny's journal, the photographs of the underground chamber, the symbols, the altar, and the rituals. "This is enough," Marcus said, his voice steady but weary. "Enough to make them listen." I nodded, though doubt gnawed at me. Would anyone believe us? The world wasn't kind to stories of monsters and rituals. People wanted logic, explanations that fit within the boundaries of their understanding. Adrian's power wasn't just in his strength or his followers, it was in the disbelief of those who couldn't fathom the darkness that existed beneath the surface. "We'll need to be careful," I said, my voice quieter. "If we're not strategic, they'll bury this. Or worse, Adrian will find a way to silence us before the truth comes out." Marcus gave me a reassuring nod. "We'll be careful, but we have to act quickly. The longer we wait, the more time Adrian has to regroup." The first step was contacting the authorities. This was easier said than done. We couldn't simply walk into a police station with tales of vampires and rituals. Instead, we presented what we knew in a way that was undeniable: the disappearances of employees at Kremik Enterprises, the connection between the missing people and Adrian's late-night activities, the evidence of secret passages and underground chambers in the building. The photographs were particularly damning. While the supernatural elements might be dismissed by skeptics, the existence of the chamber itself, the altar, the bloodstains, the symbols could not be explained away. It was proof of something sinister, something criminal. At first, the authorities were skeptical. The detective assigned to the case, a grizzled man named Detective Harper, listened with crossed arms and a dubious expression as we laid out our findings. "So you're telling me," he said, his tone dripping with skepticism, "that a billionaire CEO has been running some kind of cult, and you expect me to believe this?" Father Marcus leaned forward, his calm demeanor unshaken. "We're not asking you to believe us blindly, Detective," he said. "We're asking you to look at the evidence. Investigate the chamber beneath Kremik Enterprises. Follow the trail of disappearances. The truth is there, whether you want to see it or not." Reluctantly, Harper agreed to look into it. He dispatched a team to the Kramnik building, and what they found was undeniable. The fire had gutted the chamber, but the ruins of the altar, the scorched symbols on the walls, and the remnants of the ritualistic objects were enough to confirm our story. The investigation snowballed from there. As word spread among the authorities, the media caught wind of the story. Within days, it became a national sensation. Headlines screamed about the hidden horrors beneath Kramnik Enterprises, about the CEO who had vanished in the wake of the scandal, and about the allegations of a secret society operating within one of the world's most powerful corporations. Reporters swarmed the building, their cameras capturing the chaos as investigators combed through every inch of the property. Former employees came forward with their own stories, whispers of strange meetings, sudden disappearances, and the unshakable feeling that something was wrong. Adrian's empire crumbled almost overnight. His inner circle, those who hadn't perished in the fire, disappeared into the shadows, leaving no trace. The board of directors resigned en masse, their carefully cultivated reputations destroyed by their association with the scandal. Investors pulled out, stocks plummeted, and within weeks, Kramnik Enterprises was bankrupt. But Adrian himself was nowhere to be found. The authorities issued warrants for his arrest, but every lead turned into a dead end. His private properties were abandoned, his financial accounts emptied. It was as though he had simply vanished, leaving behind nothing but ashes and questions. For the media, Adrian's disappearance only fueled the frenzy. Theories ranged from him fleeing the country to him orchestrating the entire scandal as some elaborate ploy. But I knew the truth. Adrian hadn't fled. He was still out there, watching, waiting. Despite the chaos, there was a sense of relief in exposing the truth. For the first time, the darkness that had thrived in the shadows was dragged into the light. People who had suffered under Adrian's rule finally had answers, and the lives lost in that cursed chamber were no longer forgotten. But the victory was bittersweet. One evening, as I sat in my small apartment, the glow of the television casting flickering shadows on the walls, I watched the news coverage of Blackwood's downfall. The anchor spoke of justice, of accountability, of a reckoning for those who thought they could operate above the law. But all I could think about was Adrian's final words, "You've made an enemy for eternity." Father Marcus and I stayed in touch, though our conversations grew less frequent as the weeks passed. He returned to his quiet life at the church, continuing his work in the occult, ever vigilant for signs of Adrian's return. As for me, I tried to move on to rebuild some semblance of a normal life. But the scars of what I had witnessed, what I had fought against, refused to fade. Every shadow seemed darker, every quiet moment fraught with the potential for danger. The world knew the truth about Adrian Voss and Kramnik Enterprises, but I knew that exposing him wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something far more dangerous. Because Adrian was still out there, and I knew deep down that he was waiting for the right moment to strike. The office was a ghost of its former self. Kramnik Enterprises, once a towering symbol of power and prestige, was reduced to a hollow shell. The building stood empty, its glass windows reflecting the city's skyline but offering nothing of the dark secrets that had festered within its walls. The official statement was clear. Kramnik Enterprises had been dissolved. The authorities cited corruption, criminal activity, and the disappearances of employees as the reasons for its closure. But the real truth was buried beneath layers of skepticism and disbelief. The media had latched onto the sensational elements of the story, but even they stopped short of acknowledging the full extent of what had transpired. For the survivors, those of us who had escaped Adrian's grasp, life was a fractured mosaic of before and after. Some tried to move on, clinging to the semblance of normalcy. Former co-workers found new jobs, started fresh in other cities, and rebuilt their lives with varying degrees of success. But the scars remained, invisible yet ever present, a constant reminder of what we had endured. As for me, going back to normal wasn't an option. I had seen too much. I had learned too much. At first I tried. I took long walks in the park, hoping the fresh air would clear my mind. I visited old friends, people who had no idea what I had been through, their laughter and small talk like echoes from a distant world I no longer belonged to Belaine. I even tried finding a new job, sitting through interviews where I smiled politely and spoke about my experience at Kramik as though it hadn't left a gaping wound in my soul. But every attempt to move forward felt hollow. The shadows seemed darker now, the nights quieter in a way that made my skin crawl. Every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of movement at the edge of my vision, felt like a reminder that Adrian was still out there, watching. I couldn't escape the nightmares. They came almost every night, vivid and suffocating. I would see Adrian's glowing red eyes, his monstrous form lunging toward me. I would hear the guttural chants echoing in the chamber, the sound of the altar cracking under the weight of the fire. And always, at the end, there was his voice. "You've made an enemy for eternity." I started sleeping with the lights on, though it did little to keep the nightmares at bay. The Iron Cross Father Marcus had given me hung above my bed, a small comfort in the darkness. Father Marcus became my lifeline during those first few weeks. We met often, either at his church or in quiet, secluded places where we could speak freely. He offered guidance, support, and the kind of understanding that only someone who had seen what I had could provide. "You're carrying the weight of something no one should have to bear," he told me one evening as we sat in the dimly lit church. "But you're not alone. Remember that." I wanted to believe him, but the truth was, I felt more alone than ever. The people around me couldn't understand the depth of what I had seen. Even the survivors of Blackwood, those who had witnessed the fringes of Adrian's evil, couldn't grasp the full scope of it. One night I found myself sitting at my kitchen table, staring at Danny's journal. The pages were worn now, the ink smudged from countless readings. It had become my anchor, a reminder of the friend I had lost in the fight we had shared. Danny had been right about everything. His warnings, his theories, even his paranoia, it had all been justified. I wondered what he would think if he could see me now, struggling to hold on to the pieces of myself that hadn't been shattered. I started writing in the journal, adding my own notes and observations to the pages Danny had begun. It became a strange kind of therapy, a way to process the chaos in my mind. I documented everything, the rituals, the symbols, Adrian's warning, and the lingering feeling that this wasn't over. As the weeks turned into months, I began to notice things. Small, subtle things that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. A car parked across the street from my apartment for hours at a time. A figure standing in the shadows just out of sight. Strange phone calls with no one on the other end. At first I told myself I was being paranoid, but the feeling of being watched never went away. I shared my concerns with Father Marcus, and his response was both comforting and unsettling. Adrian's influence is far-reaching, he said. Even weakened, he has resources, connections. But remember, he thrives on fear. Don't give him that power over you. It was easier said than done. One evening I decided to visit the ruins of the Kramik building. It was late, the streets deserted as I stood outside the towering structure. The windows were dark now, the once bustling office a hollow shell. Yellow police tape fluttered in the wind, a stark reminder of the investigation that had torn through this place. I felt a strange sense of closure as I stood there, staring at the building where it had all begun. But I also felt a deep, unshakable unease. This wasn't the end. Adrian's empire might have crumbled, but his warning still echoed in my mind. This isn't over. And I knew he was right. The fight against Adrian and the darkness he served wasn't over. It might never be over. But for now, I was alive. And as long as I had breath in my lungs, I would be ready. I turned away from the building, the weight of its shadows pressing against my back as I walked into the night. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. I couldn't run from this. I had seen too much, learned too much. And now I was part of a battle far larger than myself. A battle against the darkness that thrived in the shadows. A battle I couldn't ignore, no matter how much I wanted to. The survivors of Kramik may have been trying to rebuild their lives, but I knew my path was different. I wasn't just a survivor. I was a witness, and I was determined to ensure that Adrian's darkness would never take root again. After everything we had endured, the fire, the rituals, the disappearances, life as I knew it was gone. The world I had once taken for granted now felt like a fragile illusion, and beneath it lurked a darkness most people couldn't begin to fathom. But I could see it now. I understood it, and I couldn't walk away. Father Marcus and I became unlikely allies. He was a man of faith, a scholar of the occult, and a warrior against the forces of darkness. I was a survivor, someone who had stumbled into a nightmare and come out the other side. Together we were bound by a shared mission to root out and destroy the evil that Adrian and his kind had spread across the world. It began with whispers, rumors of strange disappearances and mysterious deaths. Small towns where entire families vanished without a trace. Urban centers where powerful figures operated behind closed doors, their influence reaching into every corner of society. The patterns were always the same: unexplained gaps in records, symbols hidden in plain sight, and an overwhelming sense of fear in the communities we visited. Marcus and I followed every lead, no matter how small. We traveled to remote villages, decaying mansions, and abandoned factories, uncovering the layers of vampire covens that had taken root over centuries. Each new encounter brought its own challenges, its own horrors. In one town, we discovered a coven that operated out of a crumbling cathedral, using the guise of charity to lure in their victims. In another, a seemingly ordinary shipping company was a front for smuggling human sacrifices across borders. Every time we found a new coven, the memories of Kramik enterprises came rushing back: the glowing symbols, the blood-stained altar, Adrian's sneer as he promised revenge. But with each victory, I felt a little stronger, a little more capable of standing against the darkness. It wasn't easy. The covens were ruthless, their members powerful and cunning. They fought to protect their secrets, and there were times when we barely escaped with our lives. Marcus bore scars from every battle, his once steady hands now trembling from the weight of years spent wielding holy water and silver stakes. I wasn't untouched either. My nightmares grew darker, my mind burdened by the things I had seen. But we pressed on. Each victory was a small but significant blow against the forces of evil. For every coven we destroyed, we freed countless lives from their grasp, giving hope to communities that had been suffocated by fear. Word of our work began to spread. People sought us out, desperate for help, their stories filled with the same despair and terror that had once consumed me. They showed us photos of missing loved ones, strange markings that appeared in their towns, and eerie encounters they couldn't explain. I started to see Danny in their faces and their pleas for help. I thought of him every time we entered a new lair, every time we destroyed another altar, or sent another creature back into the darkness. Danny's journal had been the beginning of this fight, and in a way, his voice guided me even now. One day, after a particularly grueling battle against a coven that had been operating in a forgotten mining town, Marcus and I sat together on a hill overlooking the ruins of their lair. The sun was setting, painting the sky with hues of orange and red. "Do you ever think about how this ends?" I asked, my voice quiet. Marcus took a long breath, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "I thought about it," he said, "but I don't think it ends the way we want it to. This isn't a battle we'll ever truly win. The darkness is ancient. It's relentless. For every victory, there's another shadow waiting to rise." His words were heavy, but I nodded, understanding what he meant. So why keep fighting? He turned to me then, his expression tired but unwavering. "Because every life we save, every evil we stop at matters. Even if we don't see the end, we're part of the fight. And that's enough." His words stayed with me as we continued our work, traveling from town to town, uncovering the hidden evils that thrived in the shadows. The years passed, and the world changed around us. Marcus grew older, his strength waning but his faith unshaken. I took on more of the battles, my resolve hardened by the memories of what we had accomplished together. And Adrian, he was still out there, somewhere. I could feel it, a constant presence at the edge of my thoughts. I knew he hadn't forgotten me, just as I hadn't forgotten him. But I also knew that when the time came, when he finally returned, I would be ready. Because this was my life now, my mission. To stand against the darkness, no matter the cost. To ensure that no one else would suffer the way Danny had, the way the victims of Kramik Enterprises had. And though the fight was far from over, I found a strange sense of peace in my purpose. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the world into twilight, I stood with Father Marcus one last time, our silhouettes outlined against the fading light. The night stretched before us, vast and uncertain, but I wasn't afraid. For the first time, I felt truly alive, because I had seen the darkness, and I had chosen to fight.